the Russians had no alternative but to respond. They responded because, well, what happens in their backyard is of vital importance to them, and Medvedev has risen to the occasion. That's my point of view. Here's Val in Vienna. Val's a man.
How are you doing, George?
I'm doing fine, Val. Thanks for phoning. I'm sorry I mistook you for a lady.
Not a problem. Happens all the time. Listen, I disagree with almost everything you stand for and say.
Okay. Good to hear that we've got listeners in Vienna.
It's also a pleasure, I'm sorry to say, to see your alleged anti-war credentials in tatters tonight.
Oh, really? Tell me why.
You surely cannot possibly also deny the reality that the Russians, for whom you have a great admiration, seemingly, have exploited this situation to try and undermine the entire Georgian state. They're not driven by concern for the people of South Ossetia, most of whom, by the way, are not ethnic Russians.
Well, I'm not sure that contribution quite leaves my anti-war credentials in tatters, Val, if you'll forgive me saying so, especially as you do not dissent from the analysis that I set out. I'm not a pacifist, as I suspect you know if you're a regular listener. I do believe that there are times when one has to fight, and one of those is when one's vital national interests are threatened.
How, given what you have just said, how can you justify the presence of Russian troops in Georgian territory?
Well, I don't think that there are Russian troops in Georgian territory. There were for a few days after the fighting, but they've been withdrawn. And even those that were in Georgian territory, it's been testified to by numerous television journalists that I have seen that they were not fighting, merely sitting around in their vehicles. Russia has a right to enter South Ossetia and to enter Abkhazia to defend its national interests and its nationals.
The Russians have been handing out passports in South Ossetia.
Well, look, you say that. You can couch it as pejoratively as you like, Val, handing out passports.
I just feel it is very, very naive. It is naive in the extreme to suggest that an individual of Mr. Vladimir Putin's, kindness and charm is lying awake at night fretting about the welfare of the Ossetian people.
You know, what I'm worried about is that you seem to be saying that it's okay and you're happy with Russia.
Well, it's okay for Russia to intervene, and the Russian troops have every right to be in Abkhazia to defend their interests, and if that means destroying the naval assets of the aggressive Georgian state, so much the better.
I'm thinking you're saying that Russian troops have withdrawn simply to South Ossetia.
Yes.
This is patently untrue. It's being shown on lots of news channels at the moment, and I'm talking on the BBC News, that Russian troops have spread themselves right across Georgia and are currently trashing the hardware of the Georgian military forces. There have been journalists and investigative journalists in Georgia today saying they're being passed by great columns of Russian military vehicles spreading further and further out into Georgia, who do not look as if they've just come for a half a day. They're come to stay. They've come to occupy Georgia and give it a very bloody nose.
Well, they've already given it a very bloody nose. Now, Ronnie in Airdrie, who's always good for a laugh, thinks I'm a hypocrite. Let's hear why. Go ahead, Ronnie. I don't know why I do this, but go ahead.
Hi, George. I don't know how I can follow that comment there. But can I make a comment before you go in your soapbox?
Of course. That's why I've let you on the show.
And you promise not to turn me down?
No, I don't promise anything of the kind.
Right, George.
Okay, we've had enough already.
It's difficult to know why, a month before the Olympic Games, the Russians started to mass their forces on the border with Russia and Georgia. It's difficult to know why they suddenly engaged in improving railway transport in Abkhazia. It's difficult to know why their so-called peacekeepers seem to be encouraging and also turning a blind eye on a sudden, exactly a week before the Olympics, sudden increase in attacks that were increasing by the day on Georgian villages within South Ossetia. Why was this happening? Why was it that a Russian officer was caught with his car full of thousands of Russian passports, not even signed. You know, it's difficult to know why that happened too. So I'm not saying that it was perhaps, possibly the wrong moment for Georgia to say enough is enough. But on the other hand, a whole lot was going on the other side as well. What I find terribly sad is that people like you, George, are encouraging the Russian government along these lines. You know, if the good friends of Russia would tell the government that this is not the way to make yourself loved, it's better to be loved than to be feared, and to have good relations and keep to the law. I think that if you want to look back over the years, you can see that there was a tremendous amount of bullying and Russian tanks coming into Georgia in the 1990s. This isn't the first time they've done this. You have to see a very scared and frightened state of Georgia. The second thing is that I think you are totally misled. Not your fault, but because of the propaganda. Ossetia, under the Soviet Georgian Republic, had less rights than Scotland has today in the United Kingdom. It was absolutely part and parcel of the Soviet Georgian Republic, Socialist Republic.
Well, they don't want to be part of Georgia. Whether they should or not is another matter.
Who is they? You know, 20,000 Georgians also lived in Ossetia. Who aren't they?
Well, the majority, Dr. Tamara, the great majority. I think we can agree on that. I mean, it's very important that we don't try and mislead anyone. Let's agree, I hope you'll agree, that the majority of people in South Ossetia and the majority of people in Abkhazia do not wish to be part of Georgia.
Well, I'm sorry, if you count the Georgians who were driven out of Abkhazia, there were 250,000 of them. They were living in Abkhazia, and they would have formed a majority. They were ethnically cleansed from Abkhazia, and you mustn't forget that, George. Please don't descend to that kind of level. What is more, which you don't seem to remember, is that there are at least 200,000 Ossetians living in mainland Georgia.
Chauvinism, Georgian chauvinism, is out and rampant on the streets of your country now, isn't it? Georgia for the Georgians, that was the slogan, wasn't it?
Sorry. For one, I think you ought to know that I was born in Great Britain. I'm third generation British. I was born in Oswestry in Shropshire. So
and your answer to my point is what?
I'm not being... Your point being that my view is based on historic facts. And the facts are the 20,000 Georgian villagers might never be able to return to their villages, which happen to be in the territory of South Ossetia, and they do not want to be free. The 250,000 Georgians who had to leave Abkhazia and leave, they are also Abkhaz, and they should be allowed to go back to their territory. And I also think, and I really do think, and I beg you to think of the consequences of encouraging Russia, where there are many people who would rather that Russia was seen as a warm, good neighbour and not a bully. And
well, thank you very much, Dr. Tamara. I think we've given you a good crack of the whip, and you've had plenty of time to lay out your stall. I salute your courage, your strength, your indefatigability. Thank you, my friend. Very kind. Eddie in Leith says that Dr. Tamara's informed and solid knowledge put your sensationalist soundbites back in kindergarten. More of her, says Eddie. Dave in Frisco in Texas believes the same. George, that doctor just hammered you on the South Ossetia, Georgia issue without resorting to any of the low blows you tried to shell in. I think you've been dethroned on this issue. I want a rematch. Enoch in Leominster says, George, why don't you go and live in Russia if it's so good? If you did, you'd be doing the majority of people in England the only favour they've ever had off you. Hope the remainder of your birthday is rubbish, says Enoch in Leominster. Do you know this, Enoch? For many years people used to shout, go back to Russia to me.
the Ukrainian, the native of Kiev. And now I am on Maidan, on the central part of my city. I want you to know why thousands of people all over my country are on the streets. There is only one reason. We want to be free from a dictatorship. We want to be free from the politicians who work only for themselves, who are ready to shoot, to beat, to injure people just for saving their money, just for saving their houses, just to saving their power. I want these people who are here, who have dignity, who are brave, I want them to live a normal life. We are civilized people, but our governments are barbarians. That's not a Soviet Union. We want our courts not to be corrupted. We want to be free. I know that maybe tomorrow we will have no phone, no internet connection, and we will be alone here. And maybe policemen will murder us one after another when it will be dark here. That's why I ask you now to help us. We have this freedom inside our hearts. We have this freedom in our minds. And now I ask you to build this freedom in our country. You can help us only by telling this story to your friends, only by sharing this video. Please share it. Speak to your friends, speak to your family, speak to your government, and show that you support us.
We're with the anti-government fighters. We're on the way to a training camp here in the city of Lugansk. They're not telling us exactly where this camp is because of security reasons. Badman, how much time will it take us to get there?
It's secret.
It's secret. But we'll know when we get there. Batman was a former officer with the Ukrainian elite police before switching sides. Only a month ago, he commanded a team of just 12 men. Today, they number more than 100 and are growing by the day. All of them volunteers, each with a code name to hide his identity. How is the situation on the ground at the moment?
People are very scared. The city's preparing for war. We're evacuating women and children from the city.
Batman says the Ukrainian military's tactic is to attack from behind, so he's had his men sprawl out across the city. We're about to approach the camp, and Batman's asked us to switch off the camera. Deep in the forest, it's easy to see why they've set up base here. Everything is camouflaged, making it difficult for the Ukrainian army to find them. We're now at the military training camp, and we're off to see them do training with knives.
This is training for close combat, but I hope it won't come to that. The Ukrainian army is not planning on close combat fighting. They hit from the air, bombing with heavy artillery like in Slavyansk and Donetsk.
The guys here come from just about every background. You have former students, you have former businessmen, you have former drivers, and you also have ex-military and police. So you have people with a lot of military experience, but you also have some for whom this is the first time that they're picking up a knife or a gun. And so the sharing of skills and experience is vital. The guys have told me to put 2 of these in my ears because there's going to be a hell of a noise. The automatic weapon training is the most important. Batman keeps tight control over his men. Many still have families inside Ukraine and worry constantly about them.
It's not becoming a war, it's already a war.
Most of the guys are citizens of Lugansk city. They're highly motivated. They're between the ages of 20 and 55. When I asked one of them whether there are enough people here to take on the Ukrainian military, his answer was, there's enough. But how many more need to die before the Kiev government itself declares enough is enough? Paula Slier, RT, outside Lugansk, eastern Ukraine.
All the diplomatic manoeuvring seems far removed from what's going on here on the ground. Throughout the day, the Ukrainian army has been preparing for the worst. The Russian border is just a few minutes drive that way, and throughout the day the military have been pulling up armoured vehicles and tanks, digging them into strategic positions. Take this for example, a T-64 tank built in the Soviet era, but still very much one of the Ukrainian army's main battle weapons. I can't show you for strategic reasons, but across their lower lying ground and a bridge, the Ukrainian army say that their order is to defend that bridge or blow it up if the Russians roll in. They're taking the threat of a possible invasion very seriously. In part of the same battle unit as that tank, this, another armoured vehicle, it's got a cannon on top of it, again pointing towards the Russian border, an area where the Ukrainian army say Russian tanks will have to come if they decide to advance. In other positions as well, we've seen anti-aircraft guns because the Ukrainians know that the Russians also have attack helicopters. Now, while the Ukrainian soldiers are taking very seriously their preparations for war, there's also a great sense of disbelief. Why? Because the Ukrainian and Russian militaries have for years, since Soviet times in fact, trained together. They've studied in the same military academies, and they still very much see one another as brothers in arms. So they really can't grasp that right now they're staring at one another down the barrels of a gun. I'm Carl Penhall, CNN, on the Ukrainian-Russian border.
Russia's occupation of Crimea and Ukraine is still one of the leading issues here in a spring like Brussels. And things are really building up with a referendum in Crimea about independence from Ukraine and a meeting of EU foreign ministers on Monday to discuss further sanctions against Russia. Well, I'm joined by our Brussels Bureau Chief, Peter Spiegel. Peter, Europe perhaps surprised us last week with its announcement of sanctions against Russia. We have a meeting on Monday. What can we expect?
Well, the question now is the follow-through. There is a big debate here, and will happen through the weekend, over how far they're going to go with what's called stage 2 of the sanctions, which is who to target specifically with travel bans and asset freezes. And the debate is really between sort of, I guess we would say, the softies, the Italians and the Spanish leading this camp, which is, let's focus very much on the Crimeans. You know, the Crimeans who overthrew the proper Ukrainian officials, the Russians on the ground in Crimea. Let's limit it to that. You have the Scandinavians, the Nordics, the Brits even, who are pushing for a much broader list of names that go all the way to Moscow and potentially even to Vladimir Putin's inner circle. So the question is going to be, when the ministers meet, where does that list go? Does it go all the way to Moscow, or do they limit it very focused on those in Crimea who are affecting things on the ground right now?
That's going to be quite a heated battle because there are quite a lot of interests conflicting here.
It is. It's both political, geopolitically, but also, let's remember, economic. And one of the complaints you hear here in Brussels is you have the Americans being very, very bellicose and pushing very hard for sanctions. But all very well and good for the Americans to do that. They don't have the kind of economic interest that the Europeans have. Not just energy. We all know about energy. You know, some countries in Eastern Europe in particular get 80-90% of their energy resources from Russia. So a cutoff in gas in particular is going to hit them very hard. But let's remember financial resources as well. The City of London has very tight connections with Russian banks, with Russian investors. There are other trade links to Italy, to Spain that could really hit very hard to the level that the Americans just won't experience if they have sanctions.
Now, that's one level of sanctions, but I mean, is there a possibility that sanctions could go much, much further if circumstances change?
Yeah, and that's going to be the big debate actually for later in the week. On Thursday, we actually have the heads of state and government, the prime ministers, the presidents, coming to Brussels for one of their normally scheduled summits, but it's been completely taken over by the Ukraine events. And this is what's going to be called phase 3. Do they go for full-bore energy, trade, financial, arms embargo, full swath of sort of Iran-style sanctions against Russia? There are those who are pushing for that, and there are questions about what would trigger that. Is their failure to de-escalate in Crimea going to be the trigger that they don't pull their troops back to their bases? Is that enough? Is it escalating the conflict in Crimea? Is it escalating it to other parts of Ukraine? What is that trigger? And that's going to be the fight that moves to Thursday, this phase 3 sanctions. What should they include, and what is the trigger? And that's where the debate is going to move over the course of the next week.
An unfair question with crystal ball gazing. What's your prediction on that meeting on Thursday?
My prediction is they'll go pretty far on phase 2. I think they might go all the way to Moscow for the asset freezes and for the travel bans. But I think on phase 3 they're going to hold fire. I think what they're going to say is, unless the Russians really stir the pot in Crimea, we're almost happy is the wrong word, but we're content to let things stand as they are. It is only if we see an invasion into eastern Ukraine, into some of the other parts of the Russian-speaking bits of Ukraine, that I think you see these full swath of sanctions, because of the economic hit Europe could really take if there's backlash from the Russians on energy and on finance.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Peter. Well, if you want to follow more news and analysis about what's happening in Ukraine and also these debates in Brussels over the next week, very important debates, please go to ft.com/Ukraine.